It is time for another episode of the Cultural Hall, and legal history will be a lot of what we talk about. So I just want to lead off with that, and I want everyone to know, and I want everyone to trust me that maybe you hear legal history and you go, next episode, this is worthwhile. Nate Oman is my guest. Fascinating. You're going to love this episode. Welcome in, Nate.
Thank you for having me.
I got a question. Do you get that a lot when people are like, yeah, I write a lot about like legal history and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and people say, cool, great to meet you. What does your wife do? Who else is in this ward? What else can I talk about?
Yeah, that I get that reaction. People aren't always really excited to learn about, polygamy prosecutions or the history of contract law in church courts, but I think it's fun.
Well, and I think it impacts a lot of who we are and what we do, certainly, but maybe we don't see the direct like translation from those court cases or those legal proceedings to who we are. I mean, look, even just to back to Joseph Smith to who we are today, that whole thing I think has changed how we are as a faith, as a people, as a tradition.
I think that's right. I do. One of the arguments that I've tried to make in my scholarship over my career is that law is an important driver of, how the Latter-day Saint tradition is developed, and it pops up in all sorts of places where you see the way in which sort of Mormonism has changed over time, and the way in which Latter-day Saints conceive of themselves and relate to other people, and oftentimes law is sort of driving change within the church. You can even see places where the development of the text of Latter-day Saint scripture has been influenced by the law. So I think it's an important part of our story.
Well, and I'm excited to get into some of those details. Certainly, everyone's mind goes, I bet they're going to talk about this as far as legal and history of the church. So we'll get there for sure. But I want to get to know Nate a little bit. You are a professor at William and Mary. Some people may know that. If you don't know any idea, don't have any idea about what that school is, tell people about what that is. It's fairly prestigious in the fact that you even have to call it prestigious.
Yeah, so I'm a professor at William and Mary Law School, which is part of the College of William and Mary. The College of William and Mary is one of the two oldest universities in the United States. So the oldest was Harvard, which was founded in the 1630s. William and Mary was founded in the 1690s.
Mm.
And so it has been around for a very, very long time. And actually, it has the distinction that William and Mary Law School is actually the oldest law school in the United States. So the very first law professor anywhere in the United States was a man named George Wythe, who became a professor of law at William and Mary in 1779. So if you're interested in history and legal history, William and Mary is a great place to be. There's a lot of history at this school.
And Nate had already done Harvard, so he's like, "Well, where else am I going to go? I attended Harvard. That's true. How was Harvard Law School? That sounds. Whenever, so I went to a state school, and it's no knock on the education because it was the education I wanted and the education I needed. But when I hear Harvard, even like just being at Harvard sounds like it's hard.
So law school in general is a lot of work, and I don't know that Harvard Law School was harder, more work than any other place you might go to law school. I really enjoyed my time there. I learned a tremendous amount. I had great professors. I got to know really interesting people. And it was a fun and exciting place to be. I graduated from Brigham Young University, and there was a part of me, I suppose, that was like a little bit scared when I went to Harvard, and I was wondering, like, well, am I going to be prepared? Because I'm going to be there with all these people who went to, really fancy, fancy places as undergraduates. And I actually found BYU did a great job preparing me. I hit the ground running. I felt completely comfortable in law school there. So I got a good education in Provo. I was very happy about that.
One of the things that I know from like these Ivy League schools and what people are saying now as they talk about like the value of education and things like that, though, is that some of your colleagues, certainly that you probably graduated with, they are often being judges and are probably fairly prominent people. Did you graduate with anyone that people would go, I know that person?
I'm trying to think if there's anybody that I can think of that I graduated with that has been in the news lately, and I can't think of any names. My one sort of famous claim to fame is that when my wife and I first moved up to Boston, she actually went to school in Boston, so she had lived there for years and years and years and years. But when we got married and moved up there, we got an apartment in a little town next to Cambridge where Harvard is called Somerville.
Hmm.
And when Barack Obama was running for president, there was this article in the newspaper that was like Barack Obama's time at Harvard Law School, and it showed a picture of the building where he had had an apartment in law school, and the article was like Barack Obama had a apartment in the basement of this building when he was in law school, and that was our building and our apartment. So our sort of brush
Hey,
with fame is that Barack Obama and I lived in the same apartment when we were 1Ls in law school, although not at the same time.
no.
I'm bald, but not that old.
Yeah. And a fascinating story that has nothing to do with LDS culture, legal history, or doctrine. But if you ever want a deep dive, the transition for Barack Obama from where he went to Barry to Barack occurred while he was in his time at Harvard, which I thought was
Oh,
fascinating.
interesting.
Yeah, yeah. Again, not having anything to do with you or anything like that. Let me ask you this about that. You're a little bit scared, name in Harvard, but you're married. How did you meet your wife? And tell me kind of your growing up and Genesis story.
So I grew up in Salt Lake City, Utah. I went to Skyline High School, which is sort of southeast of Salt Lake, little ways. My wife and I have our marriage has like a really nerdy origin story, which
Yes.
is that we met as the very end of my senior year of high school. We met as competitors in a high school debate tournament, a high school debate round. Um, and I thought she was really super cool. And so eventually I asked her out and we dated the sort of summer after we graduated from high school. And then what happened is she went off to school on the East Coast and I went to school in Provo. And we, we stopped dating, but we sort of kept in touch. So we dated briefly, and then we were friends for like 6 or 7 years, and then we sort of both ended up in Washington, D.C. At the same time, and started dating again and got engaged. So I've actually known my wife since I was like ridiculously young, like
Hmm.
18 years old or something like that, and we met as college as high school debaters.
The idea of being debate competitors is just rife with jokes that you can be like, and we haven't stopped arguing since.
Yes,
But she
yes.
won that time, and I've never won an argument. Like it, I'm sure they just sort of write themselves. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Lots of fun with that origin story.
Is she a lawyer as well? What does she do?
No, my wife got a master's degree at George Washington University in speech language pathology.
Wow.
And so she's a speech therapist and actually does what's called hippotherapy, where she uses mostly with disabled children, and she uses horseback riding as a way of helping them to learn to
Wow.
speak. And so, needless to say, if we are ever in any kind of a social gathering, her job is much more interesting and glamorous than my job is. She's also an employee for an organization called Hampton Roads Refugee Relief, which is a refugee relief organization here in southeastern Virginia.
Incredible. Yeah, I imagine they meet the two of you guys at like the ward social, right? And it's like, what do you do? Legal history. Next. What do you do? I help kids that struggle to speak through horses. Go on.
Yeah, definitely.
Well,
She has a much more interesting and probably meaningful job than I do.
now, that meeting in Washington, D.C., I've heard the tales of the Washington, D.C. singles scene within the LDS Church. Is it everything that everyone says?
Yeah, it's a little crazy. When I was there, there are a bunch of different single wards. There are lots and lots of Latter-day Saints in Washington, D.C., obviously,
Hmm.
lots of single Latter-day Saints. So there are lots of smart and interesting single Latter-day Saints in Washington, D.C. And we attended a singles branch there together for a while.
In my mind, I know this is not how it works, I'm sure, but in my mind in the pews, I want like there's like a bunch of people on the left-hand side of the pews and a bunch of people in the right-hand pews and only just a sprinkle of moderate people there in the middle as you're attending an LDS ward.
Yeah, it certainly Washington D.C. attracts politically motivated people, and everybody sort of has their team that they're on.
I love it. I love it. It's such a fun thing. Let us take a break. I want to dive right into your life's work, what you've done, where you're going, what's currently exciting, and we'll talk all about the legal history, some different times in LDS legal history that have had maybe the most impact. We'll get into that coming back in the second block of the Cultural Hall. Here in the second block of the Cultural Hall, remember you can always send us an email. Contact at theculturalhall.com is where you will send the emails that go, that episode with Nate about LDS legal history was amazing. You can send that anytime, and I welcome that. Contact at theculturalhall.com. Now, Nate, you've got a couple books. This is funny. So I got sent a couple of your most recent books, The Law and the Restoration, and the cover is essentially the same. I was like, oh no, they sent me the same book two times. Tell me about these two latest books that you've got out.
Uh, so, um, since I've started working on as a legal scholar,
Hmm.
and that's been almost 20 years now. One of my main interests has been the relationship of law and the Latter-day Saint tradition.
Hmm.
And so, over the years, I have written and published numerous articles and essays about law and Mormonism. But a lot of those articles and essays had appeared in legal journals where, folks who are interested in Mormon studies or Mormonism specifically probably aren't, trolling through the Iowa Law Review. So a couple of years ago, I was talking with Greg Cofford, who's the publisher at Cofford Books, about this. And I was interested in it would be nice to figure out a way of putting some of this work in front of interested Latter-day Saint readers or Mormon studies readers.
Hmm.
And so I proposed this idea to Greg because Greg Cofford Books, publishes books for a Latter-day Saint audience or a Mormon studies audience. I said, would you be interested in just publishing a collection of all of this work that I've done on law and Mormonism? Some of it's been in Mormon studies places like BYU Studies or the Journal of Mormon History, but a lot of it's been in law journals. And I also have a couple of papers that I've written and I presented at various conferences, but have never actually been published. Would you be interested in pulling all of that together and publishing it as a single volume? And he said, yeah, that would be great. And so I was excited about this. So I pulled all of this together in a book manuscript, and I sent it over to the folks at Coffer Books. And their reaction was, there's just too much here for one book. It's too long. So we divided it up into two books. So what these books are all of the work that I've done really over the last 2 decades, collected into one spot as a way of making that work sort of visible and easily accessible to Latter-day Saint readers or Mormon studies readers who probably wouldn't have seen or noticed. I wrote an article on legal interpretation in the Book of Mormon that appeared in the British Journal of American Legal Studies, which is probably not something that you're seeing, in the foyer of your local chapel in Sandy.
So is it I mean, obviously it's got to be pretty intimidating is not the word I'm looking for, but like pretty like pride inducing is the word that I'm trying to cobble together. That's not a word, but like to look at that and go, yeah, that's 2 decades of my life right there. Those volumes right there. That's got to be pretty awesome.
Yeah, it was exciting to see it to come together. I was surprised when I pulled everything together, kind of how much of it there was.
Mm.
Because I was thinking this would end up being sort of one fairly slim volume. But by the time I had pulled together all of the articles that I'd done, as well as a couple of papers that sort of were orphan papers that I'd written and never quite gotten around to publishing. It was a big pile of stuff, and that was exciting to think. I've spent a long time working on this, and it's nice to see that there's a lot of material there, and it's a topic that I really got interested in Mormon legal history. All the way back when I was at BYU, and even before that, a little bit when I was on my mission. So there are a lot of stories about law and Latter-day Saint history that I was really interested in. And part of the reason I sort of wanted to become a legal scholar at the back of my mind is these are the sort of legal stories of my people. And I was really interested in sort of diving into them. And I wanted to be able to tell those stories and see if they have something to say to a broader audience. And so that's been an exciting project to work on for the last 2 decades.
From a faith perspective, looking at sort of what you do, I can see the person that is a legal scholar that's like, oh, I can't believe this, and the inner workings and all these different things within the legal history. But from a faith perspective, is it that we see moments of maybe where God intervened within the legal things, or what would, if someone was looking and reading and studying what you have written, hoping for a greater faith understanding or a closeness to God, is that part of it too, or are we talking straight legal history? Let's roll.
So I've actually written sort of different kinds of things for different audiences.
Hmm.
So I've written most of the work that I've done, certainly in legal history. I've written basically for, the kinds of people that read legal history. But I've also written things where I've written them specifically. Sorry about that. I've written them. Apologies.
Okay.
I've written them specifically for a Latter-day Saint audience, right? And the thing where there are sort of two places where I think law has informed my own personal understanding of the gospel. So the first place that that's happened is there are just a lot of ideas, legal ideas and legal concepts that show up in the scriptures. And one of the things that I've tried to do is do a deep kind of dive into some of the legal materials in the scriptures, especially in the scriptures of the Restoration,
Hmm.
and say, okay, if I come to those with with a legal training and a little bit of expertise in law and a background in legal history and legal philosophy, what do I see? What can you see in those texts that you wouldn't otherwise see?
Hmm.
And to me, that's one of the sort of great pillars of my own personal faith, I think, is that I'm always astounded that no matter how often I go back to reading scriptures, I can always find something new that they're teaching me. And going through the scriptures and reading them with sort of law professor eyes has taught me things that I wouldn't have otherwise seen. The other thing that's striking to me is we believe that, you know, um, we believe in continuing revelation as Latter-day Saints, and we
Yep.
believe that continuing revelation is oftentimes sparked by questions or issues that prophets or believers encounter in the world as they're just living their lives. And one of the things that prophets and believers have encountered over the years has been the law. And there are places where there have been revelations that were given to Joseph Smith that come in response to law.
Hmm.
And so it's those stories are interesting to me, and I think are religiously potentially powerful and important because it's illustrating that broader theological principle that we have as Latter-day Saints, right? Which is God's work is an ongoing work of restoration and of ongoing revelation, and that comes in response to the world in which we live. And you can see that process at work in the way in which the law has affected how the restoration sort of unfolded over time.
So I'm going to put you to work then. I want to hear one of those examples, right, where the law impacted, uh, not impacted the revelation, but when you're talking about Joseph Smith, something that's going on that time. Let's walk out how the legal nature of the world in which we live would have impacted Joseph Smith with one of those, just so people can get an idea of what exactly you're talking about.
So one example of this would be Section 42 of the Doctrine and Covenants. So Section 42 of the Doctrine and Covenants was given. It was actually called the Law of the Lord. And so the early revelations of Joseph Smith, they were usually called either a revelation or a commandment,
Hmm.
but Section 42 was actually called the law. And what is contained in Section 42 is the law of consecration and stewardship, which was really important for the efforts of the early saints to establish Zion. And I think that we get a lot of our ideas about what it means to try and build Zion and what is the moral attitudes that we're supposed to have. A lot of that comes out of Section 42 and those rules about the law of consecration and stewardship.
Hmm.
So if you read that text, it actually is quite specifically, it's talking about this system of property ownership and how people are supposed to take their property and they're supposed to deed it to the church and as an act of consecration. And then we receive back from the church a stewardship of our property. And that sort of changes the way we think about ownership, I think.
Hmm.
So if you look at the history of the text of Section 42, the original set of rules about how you're supposed to give property to the church and how you get the property back from the church, there's an original version of those rules that's published, and it's published as a revelation. And then what happens is that set of rules ends up spawning legal disputes in Missouri. And there's actually a lawsuit in Missouri in which somebody who had consecrated property to the church and then had apostatized actually brings a lawsuit against the presiding bishop of the church over the law of consecration and stewardship. And the bishop loses the lawsuit.
Hmm.
So the result is that the system of property ownership that had been created by the original version of Section 42 just wasn't going to work anymore because it had been declared invalid under American law. So what happens is we get people go to the prophet and they say, "What are we supposed to do?" And presumably the prophet prays about this, and he comes back to them and says, "Okay, here's a new set of rules about how these consecrated properties are going to work." And that new set of rules is actually the rules that we have in our current version of the Doctrine and Covenants.
Hmm.
So if you read the current text of Section 42, as it describes the rules for the consecration of the properties and the stewardships you'd receive back, those rules are actually not the original rules that were published. They're the second draft of the rules that came in response to, I can literally identify the lawsuit in Missouri that brought those rules out. So that I think is from my point of view as a lawyer or law professor, is really kind of striking that when I open up my scriptures, I can point to verses and texts in the scriptures where I know the way in which the American legal system influenced the history of that text.
I think that that's pretty fascinating. One, because I didn't know about the Missouri lawsuit, so just knowing that that there were people that went back and said, "Hey, hang on." But then two, the modern day application, because look no further than the several action lawsuit that's going on right now with the church and tithing. People that had been members of the church who said, "Hey, I want my tithing back," and that's making its way through the court system today, 2024.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, if you look into American legal history, there's actually a long and glorious tradition of disgruntled religious believers suing their churches about property donations that were made to the churches. And so the experience that the Latter-day Saints have had and are having, right, in which as people fall away from the church and become upset about the way in which they perceive themselves as being mistreated by the church, that they take that dispute to the courts. That's a really American thing to do, right? When we get upset as Americans, we just love to litigate about it.
Yeah. I'll show you. I'll see you in court, and we'll continue to ask this out. But to me, it does seem different. And hopefully you can inform me, because ill-informed as far as this kind of stuff goes. It does feel like when churches, faiths, denominations, congregations are involved in court cases, it feels like, at least to some extent, the majority of like the normal rules sort of fall out, and that's because of the U.S. Constitution or some sort of. Am I right, or am I speaking like an idiot?
So this is one of the big issues in American law, right? So when religious issues end up in front of a secular court,
Mm-hmm.
how does the secular court deal with the religious aspects of those disputes? And so there are sort of two contradicting impulses that we have.
Mm-hmm.
So one impulse is that there should be equal justice under the law. Everybody ought to be treated equally under the law. Everybody ought to be held to the same rules under the law. And so that sort of counts in favor of, well, let's just treat religious disputes the way we treat any other kind of dispute. Okay. The other impulse we have is that religion is special. Religion is entitled to special protections that aren't available to other kinds of human activity. And that's actually written right into our law, right? This isn't something that was, made up in the culture wars at the end of the 20th century or something.
Mm-hmm.
But you find that in the First Amendment. You find it in other places in the U.S. Constitution. You find it all over, not just in our constitutional law, but all over just in our law. that we make special exceptions or a particular kind of solicitude towards religion. And oftentimes those two impulses, they run up against each other, right? The idea that there ought to be special protections for religion and the idea that everybody ought to be equal under the law. And that creates tension. And that conflict it's been resolved in different ways at different points in time in American history. And I strongly suspect that it's something that's never going to be definitively resolved ever.
Hmm.
It's just a feature of our legal system that one of the things that we do in our legal system is that we are having this constant back and forth and arguments back and forth about the tension between these issues. And the reason we don't get to a final resolution of them is it's a genuinely hard set of issues,
Hmm.
right? There isn't an easy or consistent solution. And so reasonable people can come out on both sides of a lot of these conflicts. And it's the reality that reasonable disagreement is just ineradicable. That means that this is just always going to be an ongoing set of issues, which from my point of view is just marvelous. Because it means that there will always be these really interesting conflicts to think through and to sort of learn from. And so, from my point of view, that's a feature, not a bug. I like that about our legal system.
I didn't give you any sort of heads up about this, but this part of this conversation sort of brings me to this. We've heard certainly in the last decade, certainly more in the last couple decades about religious freedom, and we hear about it in general conference. Elder Oaks, Elder Bednar seem to be the guys that will talk the most about religious freedom, at least off the top of my head. And then there's to others, it's like, of course, we're always going to have the freedom of being able to practice our religion. If you had to take like a minute or two to say why it seems to be such a big thing now, is it because of what you just described or something else entirely?
So the first thing I would say is I would say that it's always been a concern
Okay.
for Latter-day Saints. So Latter-day Saints have been talking about religious freedom, since 1833. So it's always been a central concern for the church and for the leadership of the church. And so one thing I'd say is I would disagree with the notion that it's something that we've just started talking about recently,
Okay.
or it's something that's just been a concern recently. I will tell you that there were changes that happened in American constitutional law at the end of the 20th century,
Hmm.
where the Supreme Court in the 1980s, really beginning in the 1970s, but in the 1970s and 1980s, the Supreme Court decided a series of cases that restricted the protection that religion had been afforded under
Oh,
previous law. And the sort of, I don't know if it's ironic, but this was basically conservative justices. So the broad protections for religious freedom, that was the wild-eyed liberal position that liberal icons like Earl Warren or Justice Brennan had championed. And then their approach to religious freedom is hacked back and is limited by conservative justices like Justice Berger, and then most dramatically by Justice Scalia. And the church was, I know, and Elder Oaks and other leaders of the church were very concerned by the approach to religious freedom that was taken by Justice Scalia
hmm.
and his allies on the Supreme Court, because it dramatically reduced the scope of protection. So that's in the 1990s. It was really those shifts that caused the church to start becoming more overtly evolved in recent years on religious freedom. One of the striking things I think, and I don't talk about this in the book because, the book sort of ends in 2000.
Yeah.
Um, the Elder Oaks has actually recently made some really important changes in the way in which he's encouraged Latter-day Saints to think about religious freedom. And I don't know that this is particularly percolated in to the general consciousness of the members of the church. But a number of years ago, Elder Oaks was invited to speak at the University of Virginia. And he gave a address at the University of Virginia on religious freedom. And one of the points that he made there, which I think is a very important point for Latter-day Saints and goes back to the point I started with, right, is he said, look, there are genuine conflicts between religious freedom and other interests that people have in society,
Hmm.
right? And he gave the example of LGBTQ rights. And he said, look, in the past, gays and lesbians have been treated abominably in various ways, including by the legal system. And it is important that we create a legal system that is going to protect those minorities and their rights. And in doing that, that can create conflict at times with religious freedom. And he said, it's a mistake to think that one of those positions should always prevail. So it's a mistake to think that the religious freedom concerns should always trump other kinds of rights and concerns that people would have. And it's wrong to think that non-religious legal rights that people have or concerns they have should always trump the concerns of religious believers. And he says what you actually need to do is you need to come up with a workable compromise between both of these positions that respects the legitimate interests of both sides, but also acknowledges that maybe not everybody's going to get everything that they want.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that goes back to the point I made before, right? Which is they're irredeemable, they're ineradicable conflicts between this idea that religion is deserving of a certain kind of special protection because of the role that religion has in people's lives and the role that religion has in our society. And the idea that a foundational principle of our legal system is that there's equal justice under the law and everyone's treated the same. And that there is no neat solution to those. And I think Elder Oaks, to his credit, I think was quite forthright in acknowledging that at the University of Virginia and encouraging that's the stance that Latter-day Saints that he's encouraging them to take. And I think it would be really valuable for sort of rank and file Latter-day Saints to be more aware of the much more nuanced position, I think, that Elder Oaks has articulated than sometimes I think what they assume the church's position is, which is something like religious freedom always trumps everything else.
Right.
And that's actually not what Elder Oaks at least was saying at that talk at the University of Virginia. And you can find that it's on the church's website, and there's been articles about it if you're more interested in that.
Yeah, definitely. I'll put a link for that in the show notes so that people, if they want, they can read it and be able to. You could probably even hear it, I would imagine. We live in a day and an age where you can always hear, see, read. Someone can read it to you, but we'll have that link in the show notes for folks. It's interesting you bring up that as far as some legal history. From my perspective, I feel like there's a few times when legal history and the church has been very much intertwined. Certainly Joseph Smith and all of the trials that he had in that time. And then we sort of not evaporate into oblivion a little bit, but we kind of, we're trying to set up Utah and all this stuff. And then Utah wants to be a state, and then it's everything with polygamy. And I feel like that's another like pinnacle point for the church and the law is polygamy becoming a state and everything like that. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I am so the Latter-day Saints actually publicly avow the doctrine of plural marriage in 1852. Orson Pratt gives a sermon in which they publicly announced to the world, we're Latter-day Saints and we're polygamists. And polygamy had been practiced sort of more or less publicly for about 10 years before that. It starts out very, very secret, and the secret gets out, and it becomes sort of more and more and more well known. So that in 1852, like nobody was surprised.
Hmm.
Um, so the federal government is hostile to polygamy. And in 1862, so 10 years after Elder Pratt's sermon, Congress passes something called the Moral Anti-Bigamy Act. And the Moral Anti-Bigamy Act made Mormon polygamy a crime. So the federal government, at the behest of the Republican Party, which was the vehemently anti-Mormon party, the federal government sets out to suppress Mormon polygamy. Now, what some Latter-day Saints may not quite realize is what happened. So the church does not formally abandon polygamy until 1890. So between 1862 and 1890, there is a continual round of legal maneuverings and battles between the Latter-day Saints and the federal government over the suppression of polygamy. And that's a complicated story. It involves multiple trips to the U.S. Supreme Court by Latter-day Saint litigants. It involves multiple rounds of increasingly coercive legislation by the federal government. And it sort of reaches a crescendo in the late 1880s. And in the late 1880s, we have hundreds of Latter-day Saints are being sent to prison for polygamy, men and women. The leadership of the church has been arrested or has been sent into hiding. John Taylor is president of the church, and John Taylor is in hiding because he's on the run from the federal government. So there's tremendous pressure that's being put on the Latter-day Saints. All Latter-day Saints are being disenfranchised in some areas. Latter-day Saint women are deprived of the vote. So it's this very, very long, drawn-out process. And as one non-Latter-day Saint historian has noted, it is the longest and most intense conflict between the authority of the state and religion, between law and religion in American history.
Hmm.
There is no other case in American history where the federal government or any state government has gone out so aggressively against a religious practice in a religious group. So that's a really important story for the story of American law. It's also a really important story for the Latter-day Saints because that legal furnace through which the church passes genuinely just changes the nature of the church, and the nature of what it means to be a Latter-day Saint is transformed over those final decades of the 19th century and then into the beginning of the early 20th century. So I think it's a hugely important story. And I've written stuff about this story. I think it's a fascinating story. And it's really the story that got me interested in law and Mormonism. I
Yeah.
first learned about these Supreme Court cases when I was a student at BYU. And I was hooked. I thought this was just a really fascinating and interesting set of questions. And that's part of why I decided I wanted to go and become a legal scholar when I grew up.
A question around it though, maybe out of our own not researching things, or I don't want to say laziness, but maybe putting that on people. I think that people kind of create a narrative in their mind where it's like, well, we were in Utah and we did polygamy, and then we wanted to be a state, so then then there was everything where we disavowed polygamy, and then we sort of move along. And I think that some people really assign that to just direct revelation, right? Like God came to the prophet and said, polygamy no more. And the cynics would say, oh no, it's completely illegal workings. We wanted to be accepted. The advantage was great. So we said, yeah, thus saith the Lord, and then we stopped doing it. Has that impacted your testimony one way or another to know sort of the inner legal workings of that change from polygamy to non-polygamy?
I know that the church's sort of abandonment of polygamy and the role of the law in that is sort of a sort of hard nut to crack for some people's
Mhm.
testimony. I will confess, it's never been a hard nut for my testimony. For me, it's mostly just been a really fascinating story. I will say there have been other things that have been hard nuts for my testimony. So I'm entirely sympathetic to somebody for whom this is a challenge to their faith, and they want to figure out how to think it through or what it means to them. So I don't want to be dismissive in any way
Sure.
of someone's concerns about it. But for me, just for whatever reason, that hasn't been something that has been a concern. I will tell you that I think the true story lies between those 2 points.
Yeah.
So first, it's not the case that one day out of the blue, the Lord said, end polygamy,
Yeah.
right? The Latter-day Saints in the second half of the 19th century, they were fiercely committed to the idea of plural marriage, and they made tremendous sacrifices to try and maintain the principle of plural marriage. They wanted Utah to become a state, but they wanted Utah to be a state with polygamous Mormons in the union, and the church as a church that taught polygamy. Um, And polygamy, I think, is an understandable challenge to a lot of people's faith. And there's a lot of things about polygamy that I think are troubling. And I think there's a lot of people in the context of polygamy that misbehaved, and there are things about that that are challenging and tragic.
Yeah.
I will tell you that in my mind, there's something kind of heroic about the legal resistance of the Latter-day Saints to the efforts of the federal government to suppress polygamy. They did absolutely everything they could, every possible kind of legal maneuver to try to avoid the inevitable, which was that the federal government, which had massive, massive coercive power, had set its mind to the suppression of Latter-day Saint polygamy and was willing to completely annihilate the church in order to suppress polygamy. And so when Wilford Woodruff went to the Lord in 1890, he goes to the Lord in 1890 after the Supreme Court decides a case called Lake Corporation of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints versus the United States. And Lake Corporation was the church's very final appeal. The federal government had passed a law called the Edmunds-Tucker Act, which was going to completely dismember and suppress the church for all practical purposes.
Mm.
Latter-day Saints were going to be permanently disenfranchised and excluded, essentially from political participation in the United States. There were every indications that there would just be continuous mass incarcerations of Latter-day Saints. So Wilford Woodruff is really staring annihilation of the church and the Latter-day Saint community. He's staring that in the face. And he goes to the Lord and he says, "What do you want me to do? What am I supposed to do?" The way in which it was explained later in sermons that he gave and that his counselor, George Buchanan, gave, is he says, he looked back to the experience of the church in Missouri when the Lord had commanded the saints that they were supposed to build a temple in Far West. And they were supposed to build a temple in Jackson County, and neither of those temples had been built. And at the time, there was a lot of anxiety by Latter-day Saints. Like they'd been commanded to build these temples, and they were unable to build them. And so there was a lot of concern, like, we've been commanded to do this thing, we can't do it. Are we in trouble with God? And the Lord gave a revelation to Joseph Smith in which he says, if someone if you are given a commandment and you try to obey the commandment and then you're prevented from doing so, you're relieved of the obligation. And so Wilford Woodruff looked back to that, and he felt inspired to issue the manifesto, which said, we're going to stop the practice of plural marriage. But even then, it took the Latter-day Saints literally decades to get clear on exactly what the manifesto meant, exactly what the abandonment of polygamy meant. And in some ways, we're still sort of struggling to figure out exactly what is the meaning of that shift that happened. But I am not at all sympathetic to the sort of glib dismissals of outsiders who said, as soon as the Mormons got in legal trouble, like snap, they invented this revelation to solve their problems. The reality actually is that they struggled with this for decades and decades before abandoning plural marriage. And in some ways, right, if I think polygamy is a terrible thing, precisely the tenacity with which 19th century Latter-day Saints defended that practice might be troubling to you. But in my mind, there's something kind of tragically noble in my mind about someone who struggles sort of mightily against great odds to defend something that to them is very, very important and sacred, and then is defeated. So that to me is in some sense spiritually uplifting. And this I think is not something that we always are good at appreciating as Latter-day Saints. There is a real important spiritual integrity, right, in saying we are willing to adapt. We are willing to adapt so that this community and this church and this institution can continue to do God's work in the world. And it's actually more important for the Lord's work, for the church and the community to adapt and to survive and to continue to be an instrument for God, rather than to just stick to your guns and make sure that you're perfectly ideologically pure and go down to utter destruction. And that was the choice that Wilford Woodruff faced in 1890. Do I stay true to what I've been taught forever, and go down to utter destruction? Or am I willing to go to the Lord and try and imagine what a different kind of future looks like so that the Lord's church can survive? And the answer that I, as a Latter-day Saint, believe the Lord gives to Wilford Woodruff is the second answer, not the first answer.
Yeah.
And to me, that's something that informs the way I think about my faith and the way I think about the church. That adaptation is not defeat, right? Adaptation is part of what is part of the Lord's program, and how you do that is hard. Like you can go through fiery trials before you figure out how you're going to adapt, and I suspect that's probably part of the Lord's plan as well. That's theology. That's not law professor talk. That's
Yeah.
not legal history. But that's me as a believing Latter-day Saint who's sort of lived with these stories in all of their intimate details for 20 years. And that's part of what I take away from them.
Yeah. Let's take a quick break. When we come back in the third block, I'll certainly ask you the three questions that we ask everyone who steps into the cultural hall. Plus, I got one or two other I want to get to. We'll come back and do that in the third block. Here in the third block of the Cultural Hall, remember that you can become a Patreon saint of the Cultural Hall. Go to patreon.com/the Cultural Hall, where for as little as $5 a month, you can be a part of that secret, not sacred Facebook group where we're all talking about the tangential things like Barry Obama at Harvard or whatever kind of things that spur from these episodes. Sometimes we talk about the matter at hand. Most of the time, we just go off on something that we go, hey, this happened and I want to talk about it. It's patreon.com/the Cultural Hall. Now, Nate, I would be the world's worst interviewer if I did not ask you this question. You said the idea of polygamy and the manifesto, it was not a hard nut for you. I would be the worst if I didn't say what has been a hard nut for you to crack.
So I guess two things are things that I've struggled with in my life, and some of them I continue to struggle with. So some people sort of you learn something about Mormon history and it seems off and that's a challenge to you. So I've had the experience of being challenged by Mormon history, but I will tell you the things that I found most challenging about Mormon history were not like the esoteric things that were hidden away in the church archives and nobody knew about until whenever the internet happened. The most challenging thing to mine is the story that Joseph Smith talked to an angel, and the angel told him to go dig in a hill, and he pulled some gold plates out of that hill, and he miraculously translated this Book of Mormon, and then the angel came and took the gold plates away, and all you've got is the Book of Mormon. So that story, which to Latter-day Saints is as familiar as any possible story gets, and because it's so familiar to those of us who have grown up in the church, I think we just fail to see how weird it is. And so then we learn like there was a seer stone and there was a hat. And we're like, oh my gosh, it's like a seer stone and a hat. That's so strange and weird. The weird part of the story is the plates and the angel. And to me, just getting my head around, okay, do I think those events occurred? Right? Do I think that this book that he produced is, in some sense, the thing that he says it is? And how do I know any of that? When I was a young person, that was my great wrestle with the church. And I wrestled with that for a long time. So it wasn't some hidden esoteric something. It was like Joseph Smith got plates from hell. And that's just like, that's a really weird story. It's a really, really weird story. So I struggled with that. The thing that I struggle with the most today is the conflict between church teachings and practices and ideas about sexual egalitarianism. So here's what I mean by that is that I have a really strong belief, right, that men and women are equal and ought to be given equal opportunities. And that's not the way the church works. Because the church has a male hierarchical priesthood and women are excluded from that hierarchy. And that is something that I struggle with. The other thing I struggle with is we're taught by the church, and I believe this, like deep, deep, deep in my bones, that the best kind of life that we can live is to find someone that we love and we build a family with them, and you live a life of commitment and consecration and covenant with someone that you love, and that it is not good for man to be alone,
Mhm.
and that is the best kind of life that we should live. Um, um, Juxtaposed against that is the reality, right, of sexual orientation, which is, I believe, immutable and unchosen for people. And so there are people that will never have that kind of life that I'm living, where I'm married to a wife. They will not have a homosexual man, a gay man, or a lesbian woman is not going to have the kind of heterosexual marriage that I have. But I I firmly believe that they can have marriages, right? That people can fall in love in homosexual relationships, and that those relationships have a lot of almost all of the same kinds of goods and blessings that a heterosexual marriages have. That is commitment, companionship, service, love. All of those things happen. And the church's stance on same-sex marriage, right, means that the church thinks it's very, very important that people who are gay and lesbians, Latter-day Saints, be excluded from that kind of life.
Yeah.
And I will admit that to me, that is perhaps the most challenging or one of the two most challenging things that I struggle with my faith. And I'll tell you, I don't have clear answers to that.
Sure.
I would like the church to change. I can imagine ways in which the church could change, but I'm not in charge of the church.
Right.
Those aren't my decisions to make. And in terms of what keeps me in the church, I think the church is a repository of many true and beautiful and wonderful things. And even more than that, I believe, like deep in my bones, that this is where God wants me to do. This
Yeah.
is where God wants me to be, and that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, it has a necessary and important part of God working out his business, his work in the world, and I want to be part of that. And so for me, that's enough that keeps me in. But those are the things that keep me up at night.
Yeah. The vulnerability which you just shared. I mean, we don't know each other well. I appreciate that you were willing to step into that because personally, I know you're not alone. And with many people that I visited with, I know that a lot of those same concerns are things that people wrestle with, have decided to stop wrestling for a hot minute, have left the church over. So I appreciate your willingness to kind of be able to step into that. One of the things, as you were talking about the Book of Mormon and the, praying and finding the plates, you will find this entertaining. I will leave a link for it in the show notes. But about a decade ago, Stephen Colbert is doing a bit, and he's talking about now the Mormons, and everyone's like, "Oh, the Mormons believe that a 14-year-old boy went and got plates from an angel," and people are chuckling and all these things. And everyone, if you don't know, Colbert, a very devout religious gentleman, Catholic though, and the turn of phrase that he does is the second part of this is he's like, and because everyone's piling on, oh, I can't believe how ridiculous the Mormons are, is he's like, when we all know it was from when a man went up a mountain and the finger of the god touched tablets, and everyone starts laughing because it's essentially there is something uh sort of I like your word, weird, about religion, about religious beliefs. You there is some part of it that you have to go, okay.
So in the Book of Mormon, it talks about the restoration. It calls it a marvelous work and a wonder. And we take the word marvelous to mean something like super duper awesome.
Yeah.
But marvelous has another meaning, and it had another meaning in the 1820s when those words were translated, and it's probably closer to what it means. And marvelous means something like marvel-inducing, like strange,
Yeah.
surprising, weird. So you can sort of substitute that. A marvelous work and a wonder, right, is God's work is a weird wonder.
Yeah.
And I believe that. So there's a part of me that I like the weirdness and I embrace it. But that weirdness, that strangeness has been one of the things that's one of the sort of hard nubs that I've struggled with as I tried to build faith.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. Because again, not alone. And there's some things within the LGBTQ where I just want to stand and scream, I don't think this would be how God would want it to be, but I don't get to pick. I'm not the church. I don't pick the things, but I just go, I don't know. There is definitely something still to be wrestled with, and I don't know that we're going to figure it out in the time that we have together. So I'll do this. There are three questions that we ask everyone who steps into the cultural hall. The first question is do you have a calling right now, sir? And if so, what is it?
I do have a calling. I am one of the early morning seminary teachers in my ward. So we've got three early morning seminary teachers, which is a really good because it means
Jeez.
we get to cycle amongst ourselves, and the students have to get up every morning, but we don't. We
Okay.
just get up a couple of days a week. But I'm an early morning seminary teacher in my ward.
If you could pick a calling for yourself, either one that exists or make one up, what would you pick?
So, early morning seminary teacher, I have to say, is quite marvelous. I really like being a seminary teacher. The with maybe with the exception of seminary teacher, the favorite calling that I've ever had was ward librarian. I loved being ward librarian. In some ways, Mormonism is a tyranny of extroverts. And so the ward librarian, for those of us who are more introverted, it's a wonderful because you can kind of go in there and people come and you talk to people, right? But it's also can sort of be like a quiet space where you can hide away when you just need a break. And that is no aspersions on the marvelous people of the Jamestown ward where I go to church. But I think some people are extroverts and some people are introverts, and the church is kind of set up for extroverts and ward librarian is set up for introverts.
That may very well be one of my favorite quotes in the 14 years of doing this show. Mormonism is a tyranny of extroverts. That might go down. The last question that we ask everyone, and ask you to interpret it however you may, but the question remains, what is your favorite part of your faith?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Um, I'll tell you the thing about being a Latter-day Saint that I just can't ever imagine myself like not doing. Um, and that is I love to read the scriptures. And this may be part of being an introvert. For me, the sort of most kind of primal, important experience of the way in which I see God in the world and feel God in my life is that I read those texts and I can read them again and again and again. And it's no matter how many times I read them, I come back to them. They're always teaching me something new. And to me, that's miraculous, right? I have a little tote bag that's filled with those words, and I'm toting around a miracle that I get to go back to again and again and again, which is a classic example of like the introverted answer in this tyranny of extroverts. But
I
I love the scriptures.
That's incredible. I want to tell people that, first of all, if you want to know more about Nate's great work, we'll leave a link for a couple of them. He mentioned the books with Koford Books. There's Law and the Restoration, Law and Latter-day Saint History, and there's Law and Restoration, Law and Latter-day Saint Thought and Scripture. We'll have links for those in the show notes so you can purchase those. A huge shout out to Koford Books for connecting the two of us to be able to have this interview. Second time was the right time. We didn't quite get it the first time. Time zones are hard for interviews sometimes. Do you have any new projects coming out? Any things that your mind is tickling on that you're like, oh, I can't wait?
So the books that just came out from Crawford are just a collection of essays. They weren't written as a book. They're a collection of all of the articles that I've done over the last 20 years. But over the last several years, I have been writing a book that just sort of is integrated from the ground up. That is my effort to just tell what I think of as the story of law in the Latter-day Saint tradition. And the title of that book is Living Oracles. And that was just accepted by Oxford University Press.
Geez, congratulations. That's awesome.
So hopefully, I'm supposed to have the finalized book manuscript to Oxford in January, and I'm hopeful that sometime next year that book will come out. So for those of you, you should all run out now and get the two books from Crawford. And just about the time you finish going through those two volumes, there'll be a third volume of Law and Mormonism that you can plow into. But that's my big Mormon project that Latter-day Saint project, I should say, that I've been working on for the last several years, and it's exciting to know that it's got a home and it's going to come out.
And you said that it's a book where these are collections. So can you give me an idea of what will be different or what will be a continuation in that?
So what that book does is I try to break down systematically all the places where I think law has been really important in the Latter-day Saint tradition.
Oh, wow.
And I divide the book up into basically two parts. So the first part is really about the relationship between Latter-day Saint theology and legal philosophy. And so it is asking sort of these big questions that we ask as lawyers or law professors, a big question about like, what is the nature of law? Do we have an obligation to obey the law?
Hmm.
What's the nature of freedom and equality? And I try to look at the ways in which Latter-day Saints have answered those questions, then kind of map their answers onto the broader discussion within legal philosophy and legal theory over the centuries, and sort of see, where Latter-day Saints, where do they fit?
Hmm.
And the way we talk about law, where does it fit? And then the second half of the book is I just look at differing kinds of topics that have engaged a lot of attention from Latter-day Saints. So I tell the story there of the history of the church court system. I talk about the church as a legal institution and what that's meant over the sort of almost 2 centuries of the church. And then I look at various topics like the Constitution, religious freedom, marriage. Latter-day Saints have had a lot to say about marriage law.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of arranged around those topics. And my hope is you read that whole book and you've got a sense of this is what law has meant for Latter-day Saints over the 2 centuries that this movement has been up and going on planet Earth. And I think that teaches us a lot about the nature of law, about the relationship between law and religion. And I think it teaches us a lot about what kind of thing Mormonism and the Latter-day Saint tradition is.
Hmm. Well, you'll have to come back and tell us when that book is coming out, or when that book is out. We'll have more of this conversation.
I would love to do that.
All right. He committed to it, you guys. You all heard it. He's coming back. We'll have that conversation. Congratulations, though. That's a big deal. Oxford is a great partner with the Cultural Hall as well. So I know we'll be able to make that connection. Nate, we hope that this episode has nourished and strengthened your body, that if you're not healthy enough to listen this week, that you'll be healthy enough to listen next week, and that when the time comes, you will be able to travel home in safety. In the meantime, we'll be saving a seat for you on the back row of the Cultural Hall.